I know, I do prefer using a terminal sometimes before anything else. Hello everyone, my name is Carla and I've been working as a software engineer for about 10 years and more recently as a developer advocate. And so now I'm digging into OpenFGA and some of its features. So in today's video, I'm going to be looking into the OpenFGA CLI, how to use it, how to use some of the most basic commands, and how to make authenticated requests. Also, we are going to see how to run tests. So let's get to it. Okay, so today we are going to be installing the CLI. That's the first thing you need to do in case you don't have it installed. I have the repo here open with some of the instructions. I am on Mac, so I'm going to follow the instructions here. You normally would use brew to install this on Mac, so we're going to do that. I already have it installed, so I might get some sort of like message. Let's take a look. Right now I have two terminals open because I do want to check my server running at some point, but not right now. So I'm working on the left side at this time. If I do this brew install, we're gonna see that it's probably gonna try to install and tell me that it's already installed, but we're gonna follow it. Of course, you're gonna update. Now we gotta wait. Okay, it's already installed and up to date. I don't want to reinstall it, so I'm going to clear this and just make sure that I have it. So I can do FGA minus version, and that will say version 0.6.4. That's good. This is pretty much how you verify that you have it installed. Now let's talk about some of the configuration options that you have with the OpenFGA CLI. If we go back to the repository here, yes, here in the usage section, we're going to see that we have things like setting the API URL, shared secrets, client ID, client secret scopes, token issuer, token audience, store ID, authorization model IDs. And so these are all things that we can set. I think the first one we could work with is the API URL. And the way you can do it is you can pass it as a flag to the CLI, or you can also have an FGA.yaml file to use as your configuration file. So in this tutorial, we're going to do everything through the CLI. So we're going to give that a try. So I'm going to go back to my terminals, and like I said, I wanted to have my Docker or like my OpenFGA server running. So okay, this is the command that I'm going to run. Basically, what I'm saying is I'm going to run the OpenFGA image or container that I have already in my machine, and I'm going to expose these ports, and we're going to run it. So just like that, just by seeing this, it means our server is running. And I'm going to highlight this just to make sure that we are getting things going on. And then on the left side is where I'm going to start making requests. Okay, so the first thing we can do is to create a store, and for that we're going to pass the API URL using the configuration flag we had. So for that I'm going to do FGA --API URL and then HTTP localhost 8080, which is my Docker container running on this side, on the right side. And then we're going to do store create. But then to create a store, if you remember, this is going to make a post request, but we also need to send a request body, which is the name. So the name is going to be --name, and then let's put something like test. Okay, so if you look at the right, something happens. We got the request to our local host. We got a row request saying test, row response, and so on. And this row response is basically what the CLI is going to return us on the left side. So we created a store named test with this ID. Something you can do is you can export the ID for later on if you are making more requests in your CLI. So maybe you can save that in like a variable here and use it later on. Something we can do now is that we can get that store. So basically for that, we will do something like this. So we're going to do FGA with the URL store get and the store ID, but this is a name parameter, so we do have to say store ID and then pass the value. If we do that, we'll see that the request got to our server and we got the response that we were looking for. If you wanted to, you can get a list of stores in case you wanted to test that out. So it will be store list, and that will give you a continuation token and a list of stores, very similar to what the endpoint would return. If we wanted to like clear things up, we could also delete this test store that we have here. So I'm going to copy the ID and I'm going to say FGA store delete, and the store ID is this one, and it's asking me, are you sure you want to delete the store? I'm going to say yes, and the store is deleted. So another thing you can do with the CLI is to create an authorization model that you've already created locally. So this is the Open Sample Stores repository. You can find it under the OpenFGA organization on GitHub. And there's a bunch of different stores modeled here that you can use as examples. So this one I have here, it's called GitHub. Basically, it's kind of like defining how a system like GitHub would work like. So we have a user, we have a team, we have a repo, and we have an organization. Something that I want to point out as well is that I recently downloaded the OpenFGA extension for VS Code, and so if you want to use that, it basically allows you to have like the proper highlight for your FGA files, and you can find it here in the VS Code in extensions, and you can set the color theme for it. It's very useful, so I highly recommend that you check that out. But going back to the store, let's say I wanted to create a store with this model, so I'm going to navigate to stores, GitHub, and then this file. So I want to do FGA store create, and then I'm going to say model, and I'm going to pass the model that I want to create. And the model here is going to be under stores, if I remember correctly, GitHub, and model FGA. I'm not sure if I need to set the name for the store. I didn't have to, so it just named it model. So that's fine. And we saw on the right that a bunch of things happened. So it basically made a request to create a new authorization model on the right. And we got the response. Now we have an authorization model ID that we can use for requests or other interactions that we have with the CLI. So another thing we can do is also to get an authorization model. And for that, you need to specify from which store you want to get the authorization model. So you can do something like FGA model get, and this will retrieve the latest authorization model. And then if we pass the store ID, I believe we can copy it from here because I have it on my server. And let me put it in quotes just to make sure it works. And like you see, it returned the latest authorization model within this store. And if you take a look at it, I mean, right now it's not highlighted or anything, but it's basically the same. It is the same authorization model that we had defined in our model.fga file. So another thing you can do with the FGA CLI is to transform an authorization model from JSON format into DSL. So for example, within that GitHub example I have a JSON file here. So it's basically the same authorization model. The difference is this is defined as a JSON and this one is defined as a DSL. So you can take this JSON file and convert it into DSL. You gotta do FGA transform model transform and then pass the file. This file is under stores, GitHub, and model.json. And you see the output here is basically that DSL model. So you can take this and use it somewhere else or parse it or use it as you need it. You can also do the other way around. So you could probably do something like FGA model transform and then pass the file stores GitHub model.fga, and this will return the result as a JSON. So either way, if you decide to define it in DSL and then transform it to JSON, you can do it as well with the CLI. Now let's talk about tuples. Basically, you can do everything you could with the API. So let's take a look at how you can write a tuple. Basically, that's the main thing we would like to do, probably write and update tuples. So for that, we need to do FGA tuple write, pass the store ID. I would also pass the model ID to be more specific, because it could be that, for example, on localhost you have more than one model created, or even in your production application. If you look at our model, if we do FGA model get, Our model is talking about GitHub. And so we could create a relation such as user is a member of our repository, for example. So we're going to try to do that. To do that, if we look at this, we're going to do FGA tuple right. So FGA tuple right. I'm going to pass the store ID, which we conveniently have here in our logs. And we're going to pass also the model ID. The model ID, I'm not sure I have here, but I can look for it real quickly. We have the store ID, and then I happen to have here an authorization model ID. So I'm going to copy it. If you were to do what I said to do to export this into variables, it would be much easier for the example, but since I have it on my right screen, I'm just doing it like that. So we're going to write into this store in this model. And what do we want to write? We want to write that user Carla, let me take the relations, is a member of a team. That's what I'm going to say. So I'm going to say user Carla, member of team OpenFGA. Okay. And this gave us a successful response, basically saying the object team OpenFGA has a relation member with the user Carla. So another thing you can do with the FGA CLI is to import a bunch of tuples that you might have. So for example, I've created for the GitHub example these two tuples here. So basically saying user Ann is a reader of the repo roadmap and user Beth is an owner of the repo roadmap. And we can import that file, and the way to do it would be by doing FGA tuple import. I always have an issue with the word tuple. Is it tuple or is it tuple? I don't know. We pass the store ID, which we have on the right side. We need to pass as well the file. So for that, I'm going to do -- file and then pass the files that is under my GitHub store. So we got a little warning there, but apart from that, we got a successful response. Basically, we had that the user Ann is a reader of roadmap and Beth is an owner of roadmap. Oh, actually, we had one that failed and we had a good reason. This is interesting. The error message said invalid tuple roadmap owner, blah, 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 reason type user is not an allowed type restriction for repo owner. And if we look at our model, we're getting that literally the only relation that cannot be assigned to a user is the one that I choose. So I'm going to go ahead and choose, for example, writer and see if we get a successful response. So if I try this now, I should get 2 successful and nothing failed, and that's exactly what happened. If I were to run it again, I would get a bunch of nothing successful and 2 errors, and the reasons are very, very self-explanatory, which I really, really like. So another thing we can do is to make checks. So now that we have some tuples, it would be interesting to see who can do what and just verify if that's possible. In order to do that, you have to use the query command. So for that is FGA query check, and then we need to pass again the store ID, which I'm going to pass here. Store ID is this, and let's also pass the model ID. The model ID I have right here. Thankfully, it hasn't gone away. And now we need to pass the actual verification that we wanted to check. So for example, let's say we want to check that Ann2 is a reader of roadmap. This should return true if everything goes well. So the way you can do that is you can say user Ann2 reader of repo roadmap. Okay, we got a true, that's a fact. What about if we check with Beth? Beth is actually a writer. This is false because even though it sounds like if you're a writer, you should be a reader, we never really defined that as a tuple, so we're getting a false result. And that's pretty much how you make checks with the CLI. Okay, I think we've seen a lot of how to interact with the FGA CLI, pretty much how we would interact with the API. We created a store, we created an authorization model, we added some tuples, we made some checks. But now it would be interesting to know how would you interact with the CLI when you have to make authenticated requests. And so for that, you would have to pass, let's say, an API token to your server. Now, if you remember in the beginning of this video, I ran my OpenFGA server and I didn't specify anything about the authentication or anything because I'm in development. But I could specify some flags that allow me to mimic the authentication when I'm in development. Bear in mind that if you are running this in production, you probably need to define all these authentication process using certificates and real keys. I'm gonna go to the docs because there's a very useful command there that I want to use. It's under the Docker part, setup Docker, and this is the command I was using for reference, just to run my plain server. But I want to use authentication, so I'm going to use pre-shared keys authentication. So you see, in this case, there's the documentation says copy the certificate and key files to your Docker container. That would be if you're making authenticated requests to an HTTPS server in production, this is what you should do. I am in development right now, so I don't really want to use HTTPS and have to deal with certificates, even though I already tested out. Okay, so I'm going to copy this command and I might just get rid of the TLS enable because I think it's disabled by default. So if I copy that into here and we get rid of this, we're only going to use these keys for development. Okay, so here we have our server running and now our server is expecting some sort of authorization header because we said, hey, we are pre-sharing these keys with you because we want to make authenticated requests. So going back to the left side, if I try to, let's say, FGA store create, and I'm going to create it with a GitHub model that I have, this is going to fail. And it's going to fail because I don't have any sort of token. I'm not passing anything. So in order to fix this, what we need to do is we're going to pass the API token flag. And the key that we're going to pass, if you see on the right, we set it to key 1 and key 2. So I'm just going to use one of them. I'm going to say key 1. Again, this is testing on development. This should be like a proper token. And there you go. This actually makes it work. So what the API-token flag is doing is actually adding an authorization header to the request and sending key 1 as a bearer token. Okay, so now we can talk about testing. Ideally, every time you create an authorization model, you should have some tests in place for it, and you can use the CLI to run those and test it out. So remember our GitHub example. If we go back to it, this is entitlements. I don't want that one. I want the GitHub example. So we were talking about users, teams, repos, and organizations. If we check the store.fga YAML, and again, you can check out all these examples in the OpenFGA sample stores. I will leave the link in the description. We'll see here that we have some information. So we have the name of the store where the model is, some tuples. So we have like a bunch of different tuples, and then we have defined some tests. And so, for example, you can define things like the name of the test. So here we're testing individual user permissions on the OpenFGA repo. So we're checking that user N is a reader or a triager and whatnot. And once you write those tests, you can run it on the CLI. So we're going to go ahead and FGA model test, and then we're going to pass the name of the test files, and then we have another option to say to make it verbose or no. So the tests are going to be in stores, GitHub, I think it's store FGA YAML. So in this case, we get a little summary from the tests. We had 4 tests, 4 out of 4 passing, 6 checks passing, and whatnot. And if we go back to our file, you'll see that we have our 4 tests, and some of those tests make assertions, they make checks, and so this is the results that we're getting. So now let's say we wanted to make one of those tests fail. So we could change this one, for example, and say that user Ann is a reader for is an admin. Is not an admin for this repo. So let's test it out if this breaks it. Let me actually check the tuples. So for Ann, we're saying that she's a reader and that's about it. So if we ask if she's an admin, let's say this is true, so we made the test actually fail. So once again, FGA model test and then the test file, and then we get a failing. So it says test individual user permissions on this repo, fail, and then we get the information of the exact check that actually failed. So I'm gonna put that back to what it was. This was false and this was Beth, and it's fixed. Something else that I wanted to talk about regarding tests is that the OpenFGA team have created this action OpenFGA test. And with this repository, this allows you to test your authorization model using your test files, but to do it using GitHub Actions. And so you can make sure that you didn't break anything in your authorization model when you're making changes in a pull request, for example. And they have a few parameters here. And so here's an example of how you would do it. You can ask it to run the test to all the tests that you have present, or the ones in a specific folder and whatnot. And this will run a GitHub action for you. All right, so in this video, we talked a little bit about the OpenFGA CLI. We saw how to create stores, how to create authorization model, how to retrieve those. We talked a little bit about how to make authenticated requests on your local host. We also talked about tests, how to run those tests. And we also saw that there is a GitHub action repo that you can use to run your tests in your PRs. I'm gonna leave a bunch of links in the description so you can check everything out. And thank you for watching.